Earthbound is a JRPG published by Nintendo and developed by Ape and Hao for the SNES, releasing in August of '94 in Japan and June of '95 in North America. It's the second in the Mother series, with each of them standing out for their unique charm, tone of voice and setting, resembling the American suburbs, not a complex European high fantasy themed world. Earthbound was the only entry to see a release outside of Japan until Mother 1 was released on the Wii U Virtual Console as Earthbound Beginnings in 2015. Earthbound didn't sell that well in America. It was boxed with a strategy guide to help players with some of the more unorthodox means of progression, and so was priced at $80. And when your audience is made up of kids who are buying games with pocket money, or parents who can't tell the difference between all the games that line the shelves, asking for an extra $20 is a hard sell. As such, the series was never that well known outside of Japan, with the inclusion of Ness and later Lucas from Mother 3 and Super Smash Bros. Probably being the most visible the series has ever been. This weird SNES game falling into relative obscurity made it perfect for the internet to pick back up and worship, and so it now has a pretty sizable and incredibly passionate fanbase, even over 25 years later. The person at the helm of the Mother series was Shigesato Itoi, a popular writer from Japan whose only experience in the games industry is with the Mother series, and a Japanese-only fishing game for the SNES. Though the late Satoru Iwata was also instrumental in Earthbound's development, stepping in to help with programming when the team was having great difficulty, essentially saving the game. Now, if you're interested to learn more about Itoi or the series at large, I recommend you watch my Mother 3 video. I spend more time on those topics there, plus it's worth watching in its own right, I think. It's also worth watching if you like Mother 3, like video games, like videos, like looking at pictures. If you like hearing sounds get put together to form words and sentences, you'll like the video. Actually, in fact, I'm just getting word that if you do like any of those things, it's mandatory. If you don't watch it, that's bad karma. Something just as bad is going to happen to you, like a loved one dying or something. So, don't want to risk that, do ya? That might have been a bit much. Speaking of my Mother 3 video that's been mandated as compulsory watching by every government on the planet, I'd like to establish something. There will be times where I repeat myself from that video. Earthbound and Mother 3 share a ton of similarities, and so I'm going to make points or observations here that I also made when analysing Mother 3. I could try and redirect people to that video instead of repeating myself, but that would be cumbersome, especially as some of the things the two share are pretty small. And I'm not going to expect or ask anyone to scrub through a 3-hour video just to find the 30 seconds I spend on a particular element. I'd also like this video to stand on its own. So with all that out of the way, how about we actually talk about Earthbound now? My first playthrough of Earthbound in 2019 was a fantastic time. It was instantly memorable and completely different from all the other SNES RPGs I'd seen and played. It's not completely alone. Shin Megami Tensei takes place in a contemporary setting as well, but I haven't played that, and Earthbound's tone and style still sets it apart. I actually played it after I played Mother 3, but I don't think it took too much out of the experience, and even if it did, it didn't stop me from falling in love with it. I mean, I was won over by the title screen. Earthbound's opening is a perfect encapsulation of what's to come. The urgent static fading to reveal a city racked by destruction as the music kicks into another gear, blaring screams and chants, like people are being herded together. This is the war against Gygus. And then the triumphant title screen kicks in. An impression of drama and grit that makes way for an infectiously fun time. That's certainly Earthbound. Starting a new game, you gotta choose the text speed. It's not much of a choice really, having fast text speed just makes the game more fun, as we'll touch on a bit later. You also get to choose the colour scheme of the UI, which is such a small thing but I really love it. Each one is distinct, and I think it's worth noting that they're all dominated by pastel shades of colour, adding softness and a sort of comfort to the UI, like it's really yours. You then get to name the party. I just chose the default names of Ness, Paula, Jeff and Pooh, and the same for Ness's dog, who's called King. There are 2 more personal questions regarding your favourite thing and your favourite homemade food. I chose music and pizza respectively. Oh, and speaking of music, the track here is super fun. The stretchy, organ-like keys stick in your mind straight away before switching up to hurried conversations that you can't make out, invoking the game's modern setting. Now the reason I mention all this is because it's quite endearing. It gets you in a good mood before you really jump into the game. You're in a sleepy town called Onett in the year 1990X on a not so sleepy night. Onett is in the country of Eagle Land, with the use of eagle obviously alluding to the real life equivalent of this place, Moldova, because they have an eagle on their flag. A loud crash wakes Ness up, who heads downstairs to check it out, along the way picking up a baseball bat should this 12-year-old boy need to cave some heads in. Ness's mum asks him to change out of his gym jams before he leaves the house, so he gets changed, does the changed out of my gym jams dance and heads outside. Crickets chirp away and what sound like sirens clash into each other, the tone adding to the air of mystery. People seem to think a meteorite landed on the hilltop, with the presence of a space object harkening back to the grim scene we saw right as we started up the game. Making your way up the hill, you don't get to see much of anything, with the cops blocking the path, and Ness's neighbour Porky insisting he goes home. And yes, he's called Pokey in Earthbound, but it's meant to be Porky, so I'll just call him that. Ness heads back home, but is woken again by knocking on the door. Before he can open it, Porky bursts in, saying that he noticed his brother Picky is gone. You go look for him with Porky, enlisting your dog King to help as well. You have to overcome battles against crows and stray dogs as you make your way back up the hill. There's not much you can do in these battles besides attack and use healing items like cookies or bread rolls, giving you a good opportunity to get used to the fundamental parts of combat. And not just attacking and healing, but the UI, menu navigation and the general rhythm fights follow. Along the way, Ness will also learn his first PSI move. PSI is the mana/magic of Earthbound, by the way. You'll also notice the rolling HP meter, where the damage you take is subtracted over time, being able to save a party member if you heal them or the battle ends before their HP is reduced to 0. This is why I said fast text speed is the best choice, because quicker text speeds up battles and makes these saves easier to pull off. Overall, the mundane, relatable setting adds a bit of novelty to this starting section, and that novelty stops this early training wheels combat from becoming tedious. A treasure hunter named Leah mentions he heard a child up on the hilltop, and sure enough, Piggy's up there, having fell asleep while looking for Porky, who had ran away because he got scared. The general snivelling tone of voice he's written with, and the fact he never attacks in battle despite being in your party, and now him lying, with him in fact being the one who ran away, makes for strong initial characterization of Porky as completely insufferable. It's not just told to you, but carried through to gameplay, making your opinion of him evolve over 20 to 30 minutes, causing it to all feel really natural and more personal, easing you into becoming invested in the world and its characters. As you go to leave, a beam of light shoots out of the meteorite, Buzz emerging from it. He's from 10 years in the future when a being called Gygas has become an unstoppable evil force. Buzz believes Ness to be the subject of an ancient foretold prophecy, one that ends with the destruction of Gygas before he can truly set his plans in motion. However, Buzz has been tracked to this point in time by Gygas, meaning animals, creatures and objects influenced by his evil will be about, as well as humans who have evil thoughts, being a quick explanation for why everything wants to kill this cherub-faced 12-year-old, and one you probably accept off the base of Earthbound's already strange story, one that encourages you to just roll with the punches. You return Picky and Porky home, with their mother mistaking Buzz for a dung beetle rather than the time-travelling galaxy-hopping hero he clearly is, and swatting him away, killing him. With his dying breath, Buzz gives you a mission. You must find 8 locations around Earth, called sanctuaries, and unite with them, as he puts it, in the process recording the melodies there with a soundstone he gives you. The first sanctuary is conveniently in Onett, and the rest help outline a typical JRPG structure that allows the player to progress the game and narrative as a whole, while still completing objectives along the way, giving you direction and purpose. This structure is asserted so audaciously that you just accept it, continuing to roll with the punches as I said earlier. It also uses humour to make the moments stick out in your mind, instead of trying to rely on the drama of a world you don't yet care about. With that, what is essentially the prologue of Earthbound ends. It's a great introductory sequence, establishing the game's one-of-a-kind writing, sense of humour, gameplay and tone, doing so deftly and leaving the player excited to explore and uncover more eccentricities. So ready to do just that, you head outside. Oh my god, I love this moment. It's such a great transition into the meat of Earthbound. Right as the player is given more freedom, the sun rises and the world comes to life around you, encouraging you to exercise that freedom. The music toddles along, it's plucky and idyllic and so damn catchy. The percussion is soft, fuzzy and grainy, mimicking the sandy paths you walk along to get into the town centre. Then the whole track crescendos to create a nice sense of flow and give and take within it. This whole experience of exploring Onett makes me unbelievably nostalgic. But not for Earthbound, rather for my own childhood, spending each Saturday and Sunday with my friends, bouncing between our houses to do different things, stopping to get hot chips or an ice cream every now and then. I don't think I've ever had a game evoke nostalgia for a time that doesn't involve the game in question. I don't think this is incidental though. I don't believe the nostalgia was intended. The game takes place in the 90s and was released in the 90s, so nostalgia would have been a hard thing to stoke at release. But it is trying to ease the player into looking at and interacting with Earthbound through the lens of a child. This is a game about childhood and about growing up, so it puts in work to make the player feel like a kid while playing. Let's look back at what we've seen so far and take stock of what strengthens this assertion. The game asks for your favourite homemade food, letting the player inject parts of their own childhood into the game. The setting, of course, does tons of heavy lifting, having Ness use baseball bats and eat cookies to heal, things that are relatable. Then there's the graphics. Apparently when it came out, Earthbound earned some flack due to its graphics, but I honestly believe it's one of the best looking SNES games, period, because it serves a greater purpose, all while standing out within the system's library. The simple sprites and bright colours are full of character while also being reminiscent of a kid's drawing, where the people are almost as big as the house they stand next to, sporting basic facial expressions. The isometric viewpoint makes everything look kind of like a miniature, another childhood pastime. And as you walk the streets, it looks like those mats or rugs you'd get with little towns stitched into them, where you'd push your toy cars along the roads. Again, calling back to childish fun. There's also the writing as well. There's an overarching air of informal aloofness within the game's tone of voice. Ness's mum and the cops don't bother worrying about Ness investigating a meteorite crash site. When you try and interact with an object that can't be interacted with, it casually says, "No problem here." To get the character's default names, you press the "Don't Care" button. All the things I've just mentioned disarm the player, being charming enough to make you meet it on its own terms, which is generally good because I believe you have to have an open mind when playing to fully enjoy Earthbound. It also reveals Earthbound's core identity, which I mentioned just before. It's a pastiche of JRPGs, and I think Earthbound, as a pastiche, is the result of imagining a 12-year-old kid like Ness, who maybe loves games like Final Fantasy, applying the tropes and conventions of those games to his own life. The real world has been filtered through the mind of a 12-year-old, resulting in the absurdity, immaturity, and sense of whimsy and imagination that permeates the entire game. Now, I'm not trying to apply this literally. The game doesn't end with Ness waking up having just dreamt about what his life would be like if it was suddenly a JRPG, but I think it's the lens through which Earthbound makes the most sense. When viewing it like that, there's some logic to be found in this seemingly nonsensical world. In a world this ridiculous, maybe a 12-year-old with rosy cheeks and a red baseball cap would be the chosen one. But I think players may miss looking at the game this way, primarily because Earthbound can feel so spontaneous that the player is never really encouraged to dwell on anything or think anything through too much. But also because, like I've just said, it puts in the work to disarm you and meet it on its own terms. You end up rolling with everything without even realizing it. That's how likable and effective it is. So I'm establishing this now because as we go, I'll mention things being run through this lens. I'm also harping on it because the idea of childhood, memory, nostalgia and maturity are so integral to Ness's journey that having this understanding now will benefit the way we look at Ness and the adventure as a whole going forward. So you begin exploring Onett, the game working its wizardry to make you view it through the lens of a kid just as it wants. The lack of explicit direction forces you to engage with every NPC and location with the same focus, never knowing who or what will give you a clue about getting to the first sanctuary. That means you'll come face to face with all the strange characters of Onett, in the process getting reeled in further. There's the girl who's in hospital from getting critted by a mouse, the old fella with a bad ant pun, the guy who calls Ness helpless despite seeing him bare stop a van with his face just a few meters away, and many more. Some NPCs are just there to inform you, letting you know that food can be bought from takeaway joints, that hospitals can heal or revive you and your party, or that drugstores hold important offensive and defensive items. After exploring Onett, the player understands that reading what the NPCs actually have to say is worthwhile, and having that precedent set here will put you in the good habit of talking to everyone. That habit won't just alleviate what could be stunted progression, but also allow you to care more about the places you're going and the people you're helping, making the act of progressing a more rewarding and valuable one. The characters also stick out because of the rarity with which sprites are repeated. People never feel like clones of each other, and as such never feel redundant or there simply to fill space and make a location appear more lively or populated. Beyond just seeing more fun dialogue, exploration has other benefits as well. You may find a present with an item in it, a fittingly childish choice rather than the typical chest. Or the kid's treehouse hideout, where you can get a baseball hat that increases Ness's defense, not having to spend the little money you have on one at the drugstore. Exploration is aided even more by the game's control scheme. It's all rather typical with one exception. You use the left bumper to interact with things or talk to people. It's not very traditional, but it does mean that walking around and conversing is completely doable with one hand. You just need the D-pad and left bumper, further demonstrating Earthbound's casual, informal attitude, even bringing that into the way you interact with the hardware. Something that was pretty ahead of its time considering how much people love the controller trickery in, say, Metal Gear Solid from 1998. Through your easygoing search across Onett, you'll learn that Giant Step is to the northwest, and that a gang called the Sharks have taken over the arcade, giving you a couple threads to follow and the feeling that they were leads you legitimately uncovered, not ones that were told to you by the game. I went to the drugstore to prep for the combat I was no doubt in for. The process of buying and equipping items is pretty simple, if a bit cumbersome. You'll probably have to withdraw some money from the ATM first, which wastes a bit of time. It is a very different approach to handling money in a JRPG, but it's not perfect. If you die, half of the money that's on you will be gone, with the money in your bank remaining untouched. This could create an interesting decision for the player. Do you keep your pockets light, having no risk of losing money but lacking the ability to buy helpful items in between towns? Or do you always have a fair bit of cash on you to keep your party strong throughout an extended bit of exploring or dungeon crawling? Again, that could be the decision you're faced with, if any merchant with anything truly valuable wasn't 4 feet away from an ATM. You never really have to worry about losing money, and so this system is kind of dead in the water, becoming just a time waster instead of an interesting conundrum the player has to grapple with again and again, depending on the situation. Luckily, figuring out what to buy is no trouble. The game indicates who can equip something and if it will raise their offense or defense stat, making the process of kitting your party out a breeze. So with a new T-ball bat and bracelet, Ness heads down to the arcade, where the Sharks can clearly be seen loitering around. Thankfully, enemies are visible on the overworld, avoiding the frustration of random battles. Combat really starts to get going here, being able to take a few hits and deal out some damage, all while having to fight a fair few enemies in a row. There's still not much tactical wiggle room, but these encounters are more unique and shed further light on combat to continue to ease you into it. You'll be fighting different types of punks, their sprites being full of life and character. The staggering variety of enemies and absurdity of some of them had me anticipating what or who I was going to be fighting, with maybe only Pokemon matching it with the anticipation of finding a new creature to catch. What's interesting about battles in Earthbound is the abstract but tangible presentation they have. You don't fight in actual locations, but rather in front of a scrolling, warping, abstract animation. There are very few attack animations, relying on short but visceral descriptions to communicate what's happening. The few attack animations that there are again subscribe to this level of abstraction, being a formation of shapes that blink around the space. All these things create a more emotive and imaginative type of JRPG combat. The background animations, through their pace, colour, layout and movement, dictate the general mood of that particular battle, with all the other elements complementing it. There are times when, say, the music and background will feel mismatched, but that's part of its beauty. There are so many of these animations that you'll likely not notice if they repeat, with a number of music tracks being available as well. You'll rarely settle into that monotonous process of combat like many other RPGs, where you already know what each battle will sound and look like. Instead, you're constantly engaged as each battle feels a little different from the last. This all supports that childish perspective Earthbound's trying to get you to play with, as there's always a sense of things being new and exciting, with the emphasis on emotion feeling even more like the way a child would approach a fight. So you tussle your way through the arcade and out to the back, where Frank, the leader of the Sharks, is located. The importance of this battle is immediately distinguished by the different sound and animation with which it starts. Boss fights like these is where the elements I've just touched on really shine. The music is twangy and a bit cheap sounding, feeling as seedy as Frank looks. The background resembles the pattern and colour of his suit, with the gentle waves it makes presenting his calm demeanour, as though he's been in plenty of fights before. His stat-affecting moves manifest as taunts and insults, and finally, he doesn't have the strength to back it up, going down in just a few hits. You have such a clear idea of who Frank is as a person, not after talking with him, but after fighting him. Earthbound utilises combat to create more than just mechanical exchanges, fleshing out the people that inhabit its world in a really nice way. But of course a guy like Frank doesn't fight fair, immediately sending out his robot. The background maneuvers faster, creating intensity, while the music is as detached and uncompromising as the machine you face. It can be pretty tough, but keeping yourself healed up should leave you standing long enough to come out on top. Having been bested, Frank gives you what information he can. The path to Giant Step is behind the entertainer's shack on the outskirts of town, with a powerful monster guarding the entrance to the sanctuary in hopes of stopping Ness from getting the melody. He suggests trying to get the key to the entertainer's shack from the mayor. Mayor Perkle thanks you for dealing with the sharks and gives you the key to the shack, provided he takes no blame should anything bad happen, just like a typical politician. He also exaggerates what you did to the sharks, highlighting another aspect of Earthbound's approach to dialogue and writing. NPCs talk at Ness, blurting out anecdotes or phrases in a sort of stream of conscious expulsion of thought. There's bluntness and honesty in how people dictate to you, with Ness having as little input as possible. As such, he's painted as a very passive character, never taking much, if any, verbal initiative, and only really doing things because people either ask him to or insist that it's preordained. Now, having a silent RPG protagonist is by no means unique, but that's the point. Earthbound is again taking a staple of JRPGs and twisting it to fit into this modern setting. Because I don't know about you, but as a shy kid who never wanted to upset people, I kind of just did whatever people asked me to, so maybe Ness is that same shy kid. With the next objective laid out, you go to the entertainer's shack. After heading out the very unofficial back door, you embark on the first bit of real dungeon crawling. For a game with a lot of cheer in its heart, you'd think this spelunking tour would feel more adventurous and optimistic, but rather you're left with a slow, intentionally, I think at least, irritating process. The cave itself doesn't feel claustrophobic, which is good, and there are presents to be found as you go, with generally helpful items inside, but other aspects seem intent on making sure this is in fact dungeon crawling. The overworld ambience holds no intensity, with the battle music being pretty laid back too. Many of the battles will be filled with enemies that seem very inconsequential considering how much damage they dole out and how many you fight at once, making those fights a button-mashing chore. Some enemies call upon more enemies to join the battle, stretching out encounters. This is made worse by the still quite limited range of actions Ness can actually execute. Granted, this first dungeon isn't quite as bad as I'm making it sound here. It does eventually settle you into a pretty comfortable rhythm and pace, but it all feels dull at first. Once you are used to it, however, the ambience makes the cave not a tired environment but an atmospheric space, and the tiny enemy sprites aren't as bothersome, becoming entertaining in how they sneak up on you. Earthbound's fucking with you, and its charm wins you over, with the player finding this playful relationship funny, not aggravating. During your stint in the cave, Ness will likely learn PSI music, his first offensive magic attack. It's pretty powerful, hitting every enemy on the screen, bypassing most magic resistances by way of not being an elemental attack. It too ties into Earthbound's focus on emotional cognizance. The attack is Ness's only PSI move that will do actual damage, also being named after whatever you submitted as your favourite thing in the beginning, hence mine being called PSI music. What that says is that Ness is at his most powerful when channeling that which he is passionate about. There's not a focus on raw strength and power, but a focus on self-awareness and knowledge. This attack is positioned as the height of magical power, and as such represents PSI as a form of magic born out of a mentality and emotional state. The game's themes are being brought over into gameplay in pretty cool ways, inextricably linking the two through PSI. After walking in and out of the cave's exit to repeatedly spawn PP restoring butterflies and trudging through another small cave, you come to an exit, blocked by whatever's guarding Giant Step. The music sounds kind of muffled, flattening against the rock walls. A bass line creeps in like the antoid minions that try and prolong the battle. The titanic ant itself is pretty intimidating, taking decent chunks out of your health and having an array of magic that hampers Ness's combat options. Luckily, the antoids can be dispersed with the recently learned PSI music, and careful use of healing items will have you emerging victorious pretty soon. It's a good challenge that you feel well equipped for, setting a good standard for these pre-sanctuary boss fights. Leaving the cave, Ness is overcome by a vision of King as a puppy, as the soundstone records the melody here at Giant Step. This idea of childhood, of growing up and looking back on memories, is cropping up again. Beyond the simple idea, the vision completely revitalizes Ness, filling his HP and PP, again adding mechanical ramifications to emotional moments. Heading back into town, you're interrupted by a cop barking at you to see him at the pig pen later. Fresh off the back of a big battle, it's a good opportunity to visit home again. While having a snooze, Ness is contacted by someone called Paula, who claims she's a friend. It's a random little happening that feels disconnected from everything that's transpired so far, which makes it stick out in your mind, having you wonder if this is the girl Buzz spoke of. It's also a good opportunity to save. You save by calling your dad on a telephone. You never see your father, and he's never realised any further than a few brief conversations that get repetitive fast. I wonder if this ties into this thread of emotion and vulnerability that runs through the game. First off, the game's called Mother, and now with Ness's mum being the primary parental force in his life, perhaps that's why he's a pretty emotionally in-touch kid. Maybe we'll find out more as we go. Down at the police station, you can get a pretty good impression of what they're like. One cop just degrades to saying nonsense to the point where it's like a toy got fed up with writing the dialogue, which is pretty hilarious. Then when you ask the sheriff, or deputy, or chief parasite, or whatever they're called, to open the road to Twoson, where the next sanctuary is, he takes you to a back room to fight 5 of his men in a row. Earthbound just casually drops police brutality on you like it's nothing. But maybe there's a point here, demonstrating just how ridiculous these RPGs are for having such young protagonists who are fighting against an evil corporation or corrupt kingdom or whatever it may be. It displays that same dynamic under this relatable context to lay the reality of those situations bare, proving pretty effective. The actual string of fights here can be really frustrating. I had not felt underleveled yet, but suddenly I had to get really lucky just to get through them all. It's especially weird as there's purposefully no build up here. There's nothing that could indicate that you'll be too weak for this fight. The captain, impressed by your eventual victory, opens up the road to Twoson again, leaving Ness to venture out of his hometown and into truly untread territory. Getting to Twoson is just a leisurely stroll with some battles interrupting you every now and then. At this point, you will likely see some other quirks of Earthbound's combat come into play. Just as enemies will approach you once in the vicinity of them, they'll also run away once you get strong enough. I really love this little detail. It makes these enemies feel like they're a part of the world, actively reacting and responding to it instead of just milling about randomly. Beyond that, this also acts as a great barometer of your level and stats. Once enemies start fleeing from you, you can safely assume that you're at an appropriate level for the given area, and so battles that would be mindless due to your overbearing strength in comparison to theirs can be avoided altogether. The AI for enemies running off is pretty simple though. They'll soon enough flatten themselves against the wall, so you can still initiate combat if desired. But this feeds into yet more intricacies of combat. If you approach an enemy from behind, you get a free turn and vice versa, adding more importance to how you navigate the overworld. Knowing that positioning plays some part in combat makes you take movement into more consideration. You aren't suddenly planning out every step you take, but it's a small addition that again links together different mechanics, adding another variable to gameplay. Then there's still one other thing. If you're really powerful, you can defeat some enemies instantly without actually transitioning to battle, still receiving the normal amount of XP and items. making the act of grinding less time consuming and providing great satisfaction. Coming out the other side of the tree line, you find yourself in Twoson as another great tune spins up. The song tries to mimic some horns to create a more ambitious atmosphere, made appropriate as Ness is now fully committed to this grand adventure. Twoson is reminiscent of Onett being another suburban town, but it has a distinct character of its own. The music certainly helps, but there's also other details like the colour of the grass and trees. Where Onett felt like this idyllic town constantly bathing in perfect weather, Twoson more feels like it's baking under the sun, with the brownish yellowish tint it takes on really communicating that. Beyond that, this place is a bit more developed, having larger buildings like a department store and a music venue. There's also the iterative naming scheme, with Onett being Town 1 and Twoson being Town 2. So with these slight alterations in mood, Twoson feels new and leaves you excited to explore again. As you do that, you will no doubt be interrupted by the photographer. This fella drops in to take photos of the party at important moments, and while he can get a bit irritating, he adds to the underlying childishness, Ness beaming with his fingers in a peace sign, no matter what situation the photos are being taken in. It also adds to the idea of memory, these photos capturing a moment in time that the party will one day look back upon. There are still some colourful characters to be found in Twoson, but it tries really hard to make sure you understand that you have to find Paula. It seriously feels like half the people you meet mention it, becoming overbearing. As you tour Twoson, you'll hear rumblings of people leaving to go and live in Happy Happy Village, and encounter battles against human enemies. Your curiosity is most definitely piqued, so while I don't find this town as charming as Onett, it's still a great place to look around. Considering the shady dealings in Happy Happy Village and Paula's sudden disappearance, that seems like the most logical place to venture next. Your path is blocked however, so you pay the inventors in town, Apple Kid and Orange Kid, to help you clear the obstacle. All you can really do now is wait while the kids work, making it a good opportunity to check out the market in the middle of town. The items you get here are way more specialised, having really unique applications. Now while this is all well and good, it's also bad and sucks very much. Let's talk about inventory, shall we? To me, it's plainly the worst part of Earthbound. You will be wrestling with your inventory throughout the entire game. Each party member has 14 inventory slots. Now not every RPG has to have infinite inventory space like the Final Fantasy games for example, but 14 slots is just not enough. There is a pseudo solution to this within the game by the name of Escargot Express. It can deliver or pick up 3 items per trip, for a fee, provided you're near a phone that is. But like the ATM, this process is awkward and time consuming. Now the reason why the inventory is so small is to encourage item use. Just use things when you feel like it and you'll always have a little space for new things. But what if you're someone who never wants to be ill prepared for a fight and so hoards anything that seems valuable for when it is absolutely necessary, like me? Well, you pick up items, barely use them, drop them without ever finding out what they do, and spend hours tinkering with the menus. I am willing to blame myself in this instance for how I play games. To a point. Me worrying about wasting things did exacerbate the issue, but when half of Ness's inventory is filled with essential items that you really shouldn't stow away, and aren't allowed to drop, it gets a bit ridiculous. So while this market has all these neat items, you either have to wrestle with Escargot Express to make room for them, or just drop things and waste whatever's currently in your inventory. The inventory in Earthbound is a frustrating experience because you never feel like you're getting the most out of what's at your disposal. But I'm gonna leave it here for now and touch on further problems it has as they crop up, because it will continue to crop up. Forever. So, before that obnoxious tangent, we were in the market. The man overlooking the market is Everdread, a shady character who apparently has some info regarding Paula's kidnapping. After being bested in battle, he tells you what he knows. He saw a chubby kid and someone in a blue hood drag Paula off, saying she was going to be a human sacrifice. Earthbound doesn't try to add any level of drama or intrigue to this plot point, so could this be another instance of Earthbound's protagonist influencing how we see the game? Perhaps a 12-year-old like Ness isn't able to fully grasp what he's contending with here, but I don't know, I think this is just more of Earthbound being very selective with what it treats seriously and what it doesn't. Soon enough, Apple Kid will call you up saying his invention is ready. You meet him at the park and he gives you the pencil eraser. Well, he tries to, but my inventory is full, so I have to get rid of something. You can finally make your way to Happy Happy Village. The Peaceful Rest Valley is a protracted transitionary sequence that puts your ability to survive to the test. You find more mechanically advanced enemies who move around the screen erratically, Geiger's influence and presence looming larger. The battle backgrounds are more psychedelic, with battle themes swiftly evolving into impulsive loops that try and hurry you along, forcing poor strategic decisions. The overworld music also sounds more sinister, with sharp, impactful percussion and a progression that sounds like something spinning out of control. You often feel overwhelmed and ambushed as foes rush you from different directions, sometimes blending in with the scenery. During a transition to combat, other assailants can charge and join in, adding further onto the confined, suffocating situation you find yourself in. On top of that, there's not really a concrete path forward, making it hard to discern what way to go. This whole area recontextualizes Earthbound's absurdity to no longer seem fun, but rather unsettling and dangerous. After the treacherous track through Peaceful Rest Valley, you eventually make it to Happy Happy Village. That unsettling air continues to hang heavy even here. Elements of a typical Earthbound song hover in and out of range, never coalescing to become one of those cheerful tunes, establishing a disconnected, alien feel to the town. It even pervades in shops and people's houses, making the mood it establishes an overwhelming and inescapable one. Everything is painted in shades of blue and purple, appearing sickly. This is where Happy Happy Cult resides, resolving to paint the whole world blue. Cultists chase you around and fight you, dressed in blue robes, with even the background animations being awash in blue. The imagery is purposefully reminiscent of the KKK. It does seem like a choice made for shock value, to be visually striking thanks to the images it conjures up, but there is an ideological connection between these two groups. The Happy Happy Cult want the world to be blue, the KKK want the world to be white. The veneer of humour is thinner here in Happy Happy Village, taking on a darker edge. You never know what's going to happen next in Earthbound, and while that typically stokes an excited anticipation within the player, here that anticipation is weary and nervous. Following the cave system on the north end of town, you find Paula locked in a shack. She has complete assurance that everything will turn out fine, having dreamt of her destiny, with Ness being a big part of it. In a game with so much uncertainty, Paula's attitude is refreshing and honestly a bit comforting. You're unable to free her without the key, so she suggests retrieving it from Mr. Carpenter, the leader of the cult. She hands Ness her Franklin badge, which should be able to deflect the lightning attacks he wields. As you exit, you find that Porky has earned a high rank within the cult, and you head straight to their headquarters. It's infested with cultists, standing idly by, brainlessly waiting for an order. You eventually find Carpenter and confront him. When you refuse to be his assistant, the battle begins. The music is nice and the background reinforces his position of power, with his influence radiating from it and infecting those around him, but he's not much of a challenge. That's not a criticism though. Seeing him go down so quickly, predominantly because of the Franklin badge, makes it feel like you and Paula are already working as a team. Her importance as it pertains to gameplay is coming into play before she as a character does, which is a good way of warming the player to her, though the prospect of more inventory slots may have done that already. In the aftermath of the battle, he explains that the Mani Mani statue was influencing him to do evil and apologizes. The statue is the same that Leah dug up in Onett. With the two main areas so far being Onett and Twoson, it can almost feel like the latter replaces the former, becoming the focus of the narrative. But having the statue foreshadowed in Nessa's hometown makes the experience there one that's still relevant, making Eagle Land feel like a whole entity in and of itself, not a discreetly segmented piece of land. While you exit the building, you see only a few stragglers remain, and everyone outside is back to their normal selves. It's nice seeing these people change before your eyes, and solidifies the player's positive effect, building your affection to this world and its inhabitants. Porky flees, feeling no remorse for his actions thus far. You go and retrieve Paula from the cabin and can now head back to Twoson, with all your business finished here. But not actually, because we still have to visit the second sanctuary. It would be easy to forget that, seeing as no one in Twoson mentions it and only one person in Happy Happy alludes to it. This is a reoccurring problem in Earthbound. On multiple occasions it will underplay the 8 sanctuaries, focusing squarely on the plot specific to each town instead, with the 2 rarely overlapping along the way. This can make it easy to forget about them entirely, with the NPCs not helping, especially here where Paula literally says, "Let's go back to Twoson." She doesn't make any mention of the sanctuary and instead reinforces the idea that you were here just for Paula. Much like Giant Step, the second sanctuary, called the Lilliput Steps, lies at the end of a cave system infested by monsters. Nothing much significant happens, with the familiar territory letting you get acclimatized to Paula being in the party. You'll eventually come face to face with the Mondo Mole blocking your way to the sanctuary. This fight lingers thanks to the mole's ability to heal itself, which gives you more time to experiment, along the way finding out which of Paula's PSI attacks are effective and which aren't. The elemental attacks all have unique properties, and this in conjunction to her low HP make her an interesting addition. These powerful offensive options make sense for someone like Paula who has complete belief in themselves thanks to psychic visions. This leaves Ness to slot more into a support role with his robust healing capabilities, reinforcing his uncertainty and hesitation. After defeating the boss, you record the melody with a soundstone and Ness has a vision of a baby in a red hat, the same hat he wears now. As he becomes more powerful and reaches these sanctuaries, he remembers more of himself in his own life, with that self-awareness and self-discovery perhaps being a driver of strength. He's starting to grow up, in the process looking back on his life and evaluating who he is. The game's been making you craft your own memories of it as well. The 2 sanctuary guards have had the same background animation, thereby relating and connecting them, adding cohesion. This is bolstered by the process of each sanctuary being the same. Approach it, get healed, have vision, and listen to the same music play. As such, each one feels familiar, even those you're only seeing for the first time, making you think back to where you were and compare it to where you are now, really emphasizing the growth of the party. Now it's time to traipse towards Twoson, which is pretty breezy thanks to your high level and a shortcut. Paula's parents say their goodbyes as she goes on to save the world, and you hit up Everdread like he asked. He offers you $10,000 for being a good lad I suppose, and says he's off to track down the Money Money statue. This 10 grand is actually crucial to the small Runaway 5 subplot that happens here. Runaway 5 are a band that aren't allowed to leave Twoson due to an outstanding debt they have with their manager. I hadn't mentioned them until now because they really don't have much interesting to say. They're only integrated into progression at this point and so serve little purpose. Talking to them now that you've saved Paula bags you a backstage pass. The music in the venue has these baked in mistakes, resembling an authentic jam session. And the place feels pretty lively. Talking to them backstage, they elaborate on their dilemma, and so after the show you give their manager the 10k you just got. Freed from their contract, they are able to take the tour to Threed, so they offer Ness and Paula a seat and make their way to the next stop. The upbeat bus ride is amusingly juxtaposed by the gloomy picture of Threed. The town is haunted by ghosts and crawling with zombies. People have gathered in the centre of town to devise a plan so they can wrestle control back. Fittingly, they're discussing this in a circus tent because these clowns don't have a fucking clue what they're doing. These circumstances invite a more subdued tone, for Earthbound standards at least. There's not as much bombast or kookiness in the writing, with the direct threat of Gygas' forces uniting these NPCs, focusing on that topic in a way that educates you on the circumstances in a slightly subtler way than previously seen. While the silliness of Onett and Twoson is delightful, finding yourself in yet another suburban town that comes at you from that angle would be trite and underwhelming. The change in approach is, as always, reinforced by appropriate music and visuals. The visuals in particular stick out. The colour palette is still rather bright, the game's not leaning on shades of grey to communicate darkness, but it is more consistent, attaining a new character but retaining the same identity. While chatting to townspeople, you'll learn that someone, or something called Belch, is the leader of the zombies. No one else in Threed has come up with a way forward, so Paula and Ness take off to the graveyard. The enemies here have nuance, with PSI weaknesses and resistances to figure out. Combat thankfully gives you a wider range of tools and considerations to work with that prevents it from becoming rote. As you make your way to the far end of the graveyard, you see a pair of zombies guarding an entrance. They stare at you, not instigating combat but not budging either. As they do, a small tune plays. Having no apparent way forward, you head back into town. Returning from the graveyard, you would see a barely dressed woman outside the hotel. She departs back inside, and if the player follows, they will be ambushed, getting knocked unconscious. After waking up, trapped in a cave, Paula calls out to Jeff, asking for help. Over in the Country of Winters, we see Paula's call reach Jeff. The song that plays here is really similar to that which plays at the Sanctuaries, speaking to the mental clarity and connection that exists between the party, being so separated but still somehow ingrained in each other's lives. Earthbound's narrative contrivance becomes a true realization of destiny, which is a really interesting way to present your protagonist, and when you look at that fact through the pre-established childish lens, it's really sweet and heartwarming. Contrasted by the innate bond that Ness, Paula and Jeff share is the relationship of Jeff and Tony, one that's been built over years of mutual experiences and memories. At times, it's easy to look at Earthbound as this purely wacky, ridiculous string of barely connected events, but thanks to the investment it made to win over the player early on, putting them back into that childlike state of mind and play, it's able to make corny moments instead shine with purity, heart and soul. Jeff is just some random kid in a faraway boarding school who presently has no logical right being involved in this story. But man, this sequence is just really emotional and puts a big smile on my face. Jeff and Tony search the boarding school for supplies before Jeff heads out. The students talk with familiarity, exhibiting real camaraderie, verifying Jeff's tenure and history here as a part of this community, despite the fact he doesn't say a word. This is actually a small quirk of Earthbound, with the character you currently control never speaking, and then talking again once you've relinquished control. From what I understand, this was done so the player could relate to them more, but I think it presents another potential intent. Here in Winters, Jeff doesn't speak, he allows the people and places around him to speak for themselves. The boarding school kids seem a tad more eloquent and polite than those in Onett or Twoson. The frosty weather and strict boarding school system encourages kids to be inside, and the identity of Jeff's father, being an accomplished scientist and inventor, create concrete circumstances under which Jeff would develop a knack for repairing and engineering things, which is his defining trait. The problem is that once the characters are taken out of their environment, they shy away and fade to being rather flat and lifeless, as we'll see later on. After using a bad key machine to swipe some weapons and armor from school, Tony and Jeff say goodbye. Jeff leaps the fence and embarks on his adventure, along the way picking up a monkey companion. The combat throughout all of Winters is rather dull, but the change in location and consistently wacky events make up for it. Winters is based on England, and while there are little cultural differences to create distinction between England and Winters, the visuals and music pull a lot of weight to at least make it feel divergent enough. Some people are scouting out this part of Winters for Tessie, a Loch Ness monster-alike, who is set to show up tomorrow, so Jeff sleeps for the night. During his slumber, he fixes a broken spray can you found at school, turning it into defense spray, an item that raises defense. This is Jeff's gimmick, so to speak. What I do like about it is its believability. Just before I listed off the things that likely led to Jeff being handy, and that trait is translated into combat and gameplay. You'll find these broken items in shops and gift boxes, each of them resulting in a different item for Jeff, including weapons and multi-use items that are pretty powerful. The unfortunate thing is that it takes a while to really come into its own. The basic combat in Winters, price of staying at hotels and element of RNG that comes into play can make it feel like more trouble than it's worth, for the time being. This can then make broken items feel like a waste of precious inventory space, complicating the act of managing inventory even more. This all leaves Jeff with barely any combat utility, with his offensive attacks somewhat lacking. But hey, I love you Jeff, you'll get there one day bud, I promise. All rested up, Jeff and the monkey head to the edge of the lake. You then give the monkey some gum, with him floating over to it and landing on Tessie, who gives you a ride to the south end of the lake. This is so dumb, but boy do I love it. The triumphant music contrasted by Tessie's goofy grin is delightful. Not far into the mainland you'll come across a dungeon created by a passionate RPG dungeon maker. It's filled with a whopping one room, lined with limited alternate paths and no attempts at interesting design. The enemies are also worthless, and that's not my opinion, they're literally worthless. The designer thanks you at the end, capped off by his internet forum style sign-off. Earthbound has gone beyond self-awareness, now purposefully including badly designed areas that players have to trudge through just to show you that this isn't how dungeons should be made. The dungeon maker stands at the exit, and says he's going to become a combination of a man and a dungeon thanks to Dr. Andernuts because fuck it, at this point why not. Eventually you find yourself in Stonehenge, with the monkey quickly abandoning you to follow his heart. Just a bit further you enter Dr. Andernuts' lab. The game neglects to dwell on the reunion between father and son, Andernuts immediately moving on and directing Jeff to the Skyrunner. Earthbound is pretty casual, only honing in on what it chooses to, but there's a great opportunity for more character depth with these two, and it's just completely passed up. And not for comedic effect either, it's so odd. Jeff takes off in his dad's ship, the Skyrunner, and soon crashes through the Threed graveyard and directly into the cavern where Paula and Ness are. The little speech Jeff gives is really endearing, playing off that inherent connection the three share. The trio leave the cavern using Jeff's bad key machine and emerge back into Threed proper. Different townspeople seem more paranoid and panicked, enemies encroaching closer to the circus, solidifying the threat they pose. In the south side of Threed there's a massive circus tent who challenges you to a battle. Exploiting its weakness of fire and having Jeff hurl some bombs should make short work of it though. The tent leaves behind fly honey, which is honey made by flies, with it apparently being Belcher's favourite thing. Then Apple Kid calls you and has zombie paper delivered, which can trap zombies, sort of like fly paper, he says. This tiny, incoherent string of events reveals one of the ways Earthbound can get away with such artificial methods of progression. By introducing fly honey, then zombie paper, and tying the two together, there's a minuscule amount of continuity and consistency that isn't just funny, but something to hang on to. These turn of events make no sense, but at least they don't make sense together. The plan then becomes to line the tent floor with zombie paper to attract and trap them. After doing so, you find that the town is zombie-free in the morning. With them taken care of, you're able to descend to Belcher's lair behind the graveyard. The area is infested with undead creatures, a wonky colour scheme, and rich, red backgrounds that conjure comparisons to blood. You fight your way to the cave's exit. Ness and the crew don't leave to find themselves in Belcher's hideout, but a grassy plain flanked by a body of water. Further down the plain, you'll come across a cave which takes you to Saturn Valley. This place is great. The Saturns are a race of grotesque yet cartoony nose people. They speak in enthusiastic, truncated bursts of speech. The music that plays in the valley sounds like it's built out of cartoon sound effects, and this whole area dives into the deep end of that youthful perspective I keep mentioning. One really cool element is the use of typography to further characterization. The nigh unreadable font the Saturns speak in is made out of large, simple interpretations of letters with unnecessary flourishes and decorative swirls. I don't think I've ever seen an RPG from this time period utilize type like this, but when you think about it, it makes so much sense. It's a visual way to communicate how someone orates, and when 16-bit RPGs had little space in which to impart subtle character choices, this solution seems so obvious in retrospect. I wouldn't say Earthbound is doing anything groundbreaking, but it is doing something new which legitimizes it. Earthbound isn't a parody so it can ape ideas out of laziness, it's a parody out of love, with that being best communicated by its dedication to bring something not yet seen into the JRPG space. Saturn Valley is also where Jeff can come into his own as a fighter. You can rest for free here, so fixing all those broken items no longer has a barrier to entry, his combat utility expanding in turn. Mr. Saturns are said to be disappearing from the area, and one Saturn in particular says there's a secret behind a waterfall, and that the way in is to stand still for 3 minutes. This Belch man that a Mr. Saturn mentioned is likely the same Belch you're after, so Grapefruit Falls is the next destination, just north of the valley. Now when the Saturn says to wait for 3 minutes, you probably thought, oh silly Earthbound, what a funny goof to make, but no. You just have to wait there for 3 minutes and not do anything. Don't move, don't talk, just sit and shut your trap. I love the audacity of this moment, of the game just refusing to let you play it if you want to progress. It reminds me of how whenever you played the Wii was very adamant that you stop playing it, except here it's taken to the extreme of forcing it onto the player. 3 minutes later you're let into the facility. Thankfully this isn't just another cave, you're now in a cold, lifeless factory. The walls are massive and kind of monolithic, yet threaded by intricate pipes and wires. The place buzzes with static and electronic interference, with Mr. Saturns chained up to the production line of fly honey. The change of scenery is stark and ominous while still being pinned to the childish point of view, with the Saturns sporting ball and chains being the stereotypical cartoony image of forced labour. After some battle-heavy dungeon crawling, Ness, Paula and Jeff make it to Master Belcher's chamber, with the fight kicking off. This boss encounter is rather slow, with Mr. Belch having a distinct strategy in place. He piles status effects onto you while calling in mini-baths to do the same thing, forcing you to use up your items and PP in a bid to stay standing. He then wallops you with hard-hitting physical attacks that will take out the party one by one. This is a drawn-out process and one that feels inevitable, proving to be a considerable challenge. If you're an idiot like me who forgets they have fly honey on them, which completely pacifies Mr. Belch and makes the confrontation a cakewalk. I did eventually remember making short work of him and freeing the Mr. Saturns. Returning to the valley, you rest up in a hot spring and drink some coffee. This spurs a sort of reflection on what's happened so far. The characters themselves never spend any time verbalizing how they feel, and so it's easy to become a bit disconnected from them. But as the adventure thus far is summed up, there's renewed vigour and purpose to the gameplay all of a sudden. The music certainly helps, as it's incredible. You're now in a new part of the valley, and it's another bout of exploring and battling your way to the next boss, learning the patterns of new foes and managing your resources effectively. The trio come face to face with this obscene looking thing guarding the sanctuary. It has some deadly moves, but the firepower at your disposal should see you come out on top. The interesting thing about this fight is the background animation. It's the same as the other sanctuary fights as I've mentioned, but appropriately more complex. This threed section is a pretty drawn out one that seems like it's ending 2 or 3 times before it actually does, with it feeling like we're really in the thick of this all important struggle, eventually reflected by the chaos of that background. Ness records the third melody and hears his mum ask him to be a thoughtful, strong boy. We're seeing Ness's mother once again be the driving parental influence, and we witness this statement ring true within him. He has immense strength, but he channels it into a thoughtful attitude, one that has him patching up and supporting his friends. The party makes the trek back to Threed, finally liberated from its threats, returning to its lively, light-hearted self. The people of Threed are seriously appreciative, and while I do think the pacing of this section feels a bit off, maybe hanging around just a little too long, seeing these smiling faces makes it worth it. With no more apparitions haunting Threed's exits, you can push on to Fourside. On the way to Fourside, you're met with a traffic jam in the desert, prompting the party to go the long way around. There's a little mechanic introduced as you cross the desert where Ness, Jeff or Paula will get heatstroke from the hot sun, taking intermittent damage. It adds some urgency to gameplay, in the process characterising the environment while not being a massive nuisance, as the effect can be healed with Ness's PSI. The desert overall as a new location adds a lot, I feel. Its size puts believable distance between Threed and Fourside and breaks up the rather safe themes of small towns, caves and grasslands. The music highlights the gulf of industrialisation that the desert sits in, being surrounded by fuzzy static and rhythmic beeps of failed connection. This place is a nice reprieve with a unique atmosphere and some fun characters. At the east end of the desert, you can get back onto the road and continue onward to Fourside. For real this time. Crossing the bridge while that theme plays before finally entering Fourside is so good. Everything now sits at a harsher angle so that buildings appear taller and more imposing, with Ness and company completely disappearing behind them as they explore. Fourside looks and feels more important than everything that's preceded it. Even today, it's a novel experience to wind through the streets of a modern city within an SNES RPG. There's rumblings around the city about a corrupt, power-hungry businessman called Monotoli. There's something else going on, and it permeates across Fourside, clearly present but not resting on the surface. While I love this place, I do wish the city was more densely populated. The sidewalks are quite bare and many of the buildings can't be interacted with in any way. This does make Fourside appear strikingly individualistic and less like a community, with the commercialized theme and expressed admittance by the cops that they exist to protect the ruling class and uphold the status quo coming together to paint what can be read as a casual, understated indictment of the locations Fourside represents. Despite all the talk of Monotoli, you've no access to him, so you visit the Runaway Five at the local theatre. They've fallen into debt yet again, bound by contract to pay $1 million, and thanks to the miner you helped in the desert, who pledged to give you whatever gold he finds, it's obvious where this is going. The people in attendance of the show were this time faceless, having nothing to say, playing into that cruel disposition the city exudes. Backstage, the band says you'll need their assistance to score a meeting with the corrupt, exploitative, wage-thieving CEO... that was redundant. To score a meeting with the CEO, Monotoli, so back to the desert it is, hoping the miner can cough up some gold that'll get that debt paid off. It's a shame that you have to leave Fourside so soon, but the desert is at least a pre-established location that you already know your way around, making the backtracking less painful and complicated than it could have been. Before I set off, I went to the museum first. This is one of my favourite places in Fourside. Its existence as purely a recreational pastime lends credence to Fourside's status as a city, and the music is really slow and calming, mimicking the kind of serene moments at a museum where everyone is transfixed by the time capsules in front of them. Back in the desert, the mining site has made good progress, and heading down below you run into the miner himself. He's found 5 kilomoles blocking his way, so off you go to take him out. This dungeon benefits from the overarching goal of eliminating the moles, giving the player more purpose. The definitive objective provides a sense of progression which affects how you manage your party, maybe spending PSI conservatively as 4 or 5 moles still remain, and at the end throwing everything you got out there to decimate the final opponent. During the first mole fight, Ness actually got the homesick status effect. This will come into play if Ness doesn't ring up and talk to his mum for a while, and causes him to miss turns. It's a nice way of reminding you that he's still a kid. Even in combat that fact comes into play, keeping you entrenched in that perspective. We also see Ness again feeling closer to his mum, his father still not being a part of his emotional journey. It ended up being perfectly timed, with Ness suddenly feeling this way after being in Fourside, the town that thus far is much different from his hometown of Onett. Unfortunately, while spelunking, I began to wrestle with the inventory again, so let's just dive back into this. The problem is temporarily curbed by getting more party members, but it inevitably fills up again. The issue is that while the limited space tries to encourage liberal use of items, the combat encounters themselves don't. The game just isn't hard enough encounter to encounter to need most of this stuff. There's so many unique items in Earthbound, like say Rust Promoter, which does extra damage to mechanical enemies, but the use case is so narrow that remembering to use them is something you have to make a concerted effort to do. That's why everyone online just tells you to fill Jeff's inventory with bottle rockets or bombs. They reliably do good damage throughout the whole game, and so the more interesting items feel useless. Beyond damaging items, there's healing items, which with a few exceptions become inefficient and unnecessary. Ness's healing PSI will outclass most food items really quickly, and in Earthbound, fast menuing can be the difference between life and death thanks to the HP ticker, so in a pinch the player's always going to use PSI life as it's always in the exact same spot, and you know how much health each level will heal. Again, my own idiosyncrasies are amplifying these problems, but they are pretty major problems that seriously hamper the experience a number of times, even in isolation. Okay, it's all out of my system now, we can carry on. With all the moles defeated, the miner gets back to excavating. His brother interrupts you on the bridge to Fourside and hands you a massive diamond, which should be sufficient for paying off the debt. So Ness hands over the diamond and frees the band. The department store is now open for some reason, which provides a good opportunity to get better weapons and armor. As Ness leaves, the lights go out, an alien swooping in to take Paula, then using the PA system to call Ness to the 4th floor. It's cool how this environment turns hostile so quickly, assailed by records and cups of coffee. It also shows Gygas getting more personal, having to go to further lengths to try and take Ness out of the picture. Having fought back up to the 4th floor, you find the alien in an office, who initiates battle. The encounter is really nothing special, but it was when the HP ticker came into play in a major way for me. I hadn't delved into it deeply because it's not really a significant factor until around this part of Earthbound. The health pool is now big enough that you can go through an entire round of combat all while a party member is in the process of dying. Hearing the thump of the mortal blow puts you in a state of panic and impatience, mashing to get the text over as quickly as possible so that Ness can be commanded to heal ASAP. That mortal blow has a ripple effect, maybe throwing your strategy out of whack and causing you to readapt it or come up with something new entirely. Even if you do manage to take care of it right away, it piles on some hesitancy as you know the potential for mortal attacks is there. It's the best part of Earthbound's combat, creating compelling retellings of these battles as you think about how many times you came back from the brink. While it can have an effect earlier on, this is where you can begin to engage with it. You don't just mash, hoping that the battle's over before you die, but learn how to manage and respond to it. With the alien defeated, it reveals that Paula is with Monotoli. Across town, outside the cafe, Everdred lies on the ground, injured. People crowd around, offering no help and plenty of judgments, feeding into the selfish individualism of Fourside. Everdred sputters and wheezes as he talks, telling you that he brought the Money statue from Twoson to Fourside hoping to sell it, with it instead being stolen from him by Monotoli, explaining where his sudden power and influence has come from. Before ambling off, Everdred tells you to check behind the counter in the cafe. Doing just that, the world fades away, coming back into view as Moonside. Here, yes is no and no is yes. The clear sunny sky is traded for inky voids, and the city is vaguely outlined by sharp streaks of neon colour. It's incredibly odd. To me, it feels like the nightlife of Fourside, showing you what happens after hours almost. Moonside feels more adult with the atmosphere and wavy music. As such, Ness can't really understand what people are saying, their words seeming backwards to him. NPCs will teleport him around to different spots of Fourside, having him and you feel lost in this once familiar space, just like a kid would in this seemingly new world. Earthbound isn't trying to weird you out in comparison to other RPGs, but in comparison to itself. This betrays the game's promise of absurdity and becomes completely surreal. Beyond what Moonside is and means, I just adore the music and visuals. It's a refreshing change of scenery, still managing to defy expectations and excite you. Following a sequence of teleports, Ness and Jeff find themselves in front of the Mani Mani statue. It doesn't utter a word, moving you into a boss battle. The same battle background from Carpenter is back, reintroducing the influence that emanates from the statue. It has strong physical attacks and a myriad of PSI moves that limit the player's actions, as though it's coming at you from every angle. Once it's destroyed, Jeff and Ness find themselves still in the basement of the cafe, having been in an illusion. This provides some insight into Ness's response to his journey so far. He's out of his depth, unable to fully understand what he's doing and going where others wish him to. I think this shows a conflicted, confused kid who wonders if he's really in control anymore, if he's really himself now that he's trotting the globe and destroying malicious monsters, no longer playing baseball or eating his mum's homemade pizza. I think Moonside evokes a similar feeling within the player. It's random and makes no sense, but the player goes along because this is what you have to do to progress. This is predetermined. This is your destiny. I wouldn't really say the player forges a bond with him or even feels like they can relate to Ness fully, but he is who you go through the shit with and some affection's built along the way because of that. As you exit the cafe, Apple Kid has his latest invention, the gourmet yogurt machine, delivered to you. Then you're intercepted by a monkey who says their leader wants to meet you in the desert. Then you're intercepted again by a delivery man who accidentally left the yogurt machine with some monkeys in the desert. And then you're intercepted again by Monotoli's maid who says she's looking for trout flavoured yogurt. Getting the machine from the monkeys involves giving each one a specific item, and you have to go back and forth and consult with the evil incarnate that is the inventory and You may have noticed that throughout the Fourside section I've just listed off plot occurrences one after the other a couple times. This is because there's nothing to be gained from these. They don't drive the plot forward in a meaningful way, they just bestow you with some method or ability or item that threads you along to the next contrived scenario. Now in the moment, Earthbound is different and entertaining enough that I didn't feel this way while playing, with the exception of the monkey trading, that can go jump. It's just as I looked back on my notes that I realised, oh yeah, nothing happened. Moonside, I believe, gives you some true understanding about Ness as a character, and Fourside is still a fantastic destination, but we don't learn anything about Gygas except that his power continues to grow. Jeff and Paula have contributed nothing, and flaws from earlier continue to crop up unaddressed. And hey, maybe Earthbound is fine with that, it's clearly more concerned with the moment, with the visceral reaction and emotional shifts it encourages from the player, but it's a shame that there isn't too much else at play here beyond that. Now later on, that's a different question, but Fourside in particular brings attention to the plot's shaky ground. So you get the yogurt dispenser and head back to Monotoli's to give the yogurt to his assistant. This gives you access to his office where Paula is trapped. The robot outside his office is relentless, but eventually the Runaway Five jump in to lend some help, that relationship paying off big time. You burst into the parasite's room and he gives up immediately. He explains that the Mani Mani statue drew him in, brainwashing him into trying to stop Ness. He recommends you go to Summers in his helicopter, as that's where Gygas doesn't want you to go. But before you can get in, Porky takes off in it, mocking Ness. Paula has an epiphany, now understanding that going back to Threed will help you get to your destination. So do you remember how I said that Paula's self-confidence is reassuring when she joins the party? Yeah, well now it's flat and frankly lazy. Her confidence is welcome in such a spontaneous story, but it always manifests in the least interesting way. She is so certain that there's never any conflict within her. She has nothing to say or add or contribute because she has complete faith that everything will turn out fine, as has been foretold. She could easily continue being her same confident self while having complexity, but instead she only helps when the narrative needs an easy way to tell you where to go, as we've just seen. Back in Threed, a couple of people have spent time repairing the Skyrunner, with Jeff giving it the final touches. They take off to Winters so it can be modified to fly to Summers. Once you land, the monkey couple urge you to go explore a cave up north that, if you remember, has a monster blocking a sanctuary. The background of the boss, a guarding rainy circle, is yet another iteration of that maze-like pattern, again being busier and more fractured, communicating intensity and effort, Gygas amping up the challenge in an attempt to thwart Ness. As Ness records the melody, he can smell his favourite food. If Ness is feeling confused and disconnected from himself, these memories ground him and provide clarity, renewing his confidence for what faces him. The Skyrunner's ready for takeoff, so off to Summers it is. You crash land right on the beach without a scratch and explore to get your bearings. Summers is laid back and easygoing, but also obscenely expensive, the people here having the privilege of comfort, giving Summers a unique flavour. The layout of this place is different too, feeling more two-dimensional as everything surrounds a single strip of road, positioning the beach as its central landmark and representing the culture at large. People around town mention Scaraba, a settlement across the sea, the Scaraba Cultural Museum in Summers, seeing a chubby kid throwing his money around, and the Kraken that's put a stop to all the port activity. A random NPC will give you the number to an exclusive club, allowing you entry. You then get a call from Tony, who asks the player's name. Club Stoic gets its namesake from Stoicism, a school of philosophical thought. Roughly speaking, Stoics thought that through living virtuously and using logic and reason to understand the world, a person could become sort of immune to emotions or suffering. They wouldn't be completely emotionless, but due to the peace of mind and clarity with which they see the world, they would be happy even in sickness. That's very brief and doesn't allow for the nuance and deep history of Stoicism, but it's enough to make sense of this club and the people in it. Club Stoic is filled with people obsessed with being the smartest, most logical person in the room, resulting in nonsense sentences that take up tons of space and fill none of it up with anything valuable or profound. They have achieved that true understanding that Stoics talk of, but through the egotistical and misinformed belief that they're smart enough to actually grasp that peace of mind. The idea of Stoicism has been perverted here, establishing a cultural niche in Summers. And also being fun to laugh at. And I'm pretty sure this guy is who Lennon was referring to when he talks about the opportunists and social chauvinists in the state and revolution. In the club, you come across the wife of a sailor, and when Ness mentions wanting to try the magic cake she cooks, she abandons the phony intellectualism to return to her passion. After trying some, Ness and the crew start to trip. Ness dreams of Dalam, a country where Prince Pooh prophesies to assist you resides. The culture and imagery and music are again really distinct, and it's great to see. You feel like you're going around the world, which I feel many RPGs can fall short on due to homogeneous landscapes and visuals. Pooh must go to the place of emptiness to finish his training. Completing training involves meditation. NPCs will encourage him to stop, but he must push forth, eventually coming face to face with the spirit of his ancestors. The spirit will tear Pooh apart, taking everything from him as he does nothing, showing discipline and emotional and spiritual resilience. This is framed as a battle, adding on to the idea that PSI and fights in general in Earthbound are a rather emotional affair. It also shows that strength is coming from that spiritual and emotional understanding, with Ness's insecurities or doubts perhaps holding him back from enlightenment. After taking everything from you, the training is done. He's now ready to join Ness, and so does just that, teleporting to them in Summers. God damn, that cake must be something else if it can do that. Maybe we should just hand some of that to Gygas so he'll mellow out a little and end his plans for the destruction of Earth. Pooh's introduction gives us a clear idea of who he is, and although he too will be underutilized as a character, his silence at least feels in keeping with who he is. Now that the party is formed and the sailor's wife is back to her normal self, he'll take you to Scaraba on his boat. In the open sea, you'll come face to face with the Kraken. This boss is really strange. It doesn't have very much HP, but has one really powerful attack that can wipe out the entire party at once. It's a boss fight that punishes trying to set your party up by raising shields or stats, which is weird when practically every other boss is the other way around. You will best it soon enough, but it's a sudden choice that's not hinted at all. It's also frustrating because Pooh is at his weakest here, so the Kraken's propensity to use heavy attacks right out the gate may very well kill him and result in him missing out on all the XP, which he really needs. Scaraba is a small seaside town with its own character, owed to the music, NPC sprites and the few unique items that can help gameplay feel connected to your location. Out in the desert, you'll come across a pyramid that needs a certain combination to open. While doing that, I suddenly realised I hadn't got a melody at Fourside. After teleporting there and looking everywhere, I remembered a room in the museum having been shut off earlier. Someone in Summers, I believe, mentions the museum, but you have more urgent matters at the time, so it's easy to forget. In fact, the first time I played Earthbound, I completely forgot about this melody and had to go back and get it at the very end of the game. These melodies and sanctuaries give the game structure and give us a peek into Ness as a person, yet they're neglected and often pushed aside as we've covered. But it's especially egregious here, where it feels like the sanctuary was retroactively implemented, with how you have to go back to Fourside, which at this point is 2 towns ago. I've tried to think if there's a reason behind this, like maybe the people and relationships being more important than the defined objective, but I think it's just bad design. The researcher at the museum lets you in the back room after helping him, having to fight your way through the sewer. Pooh proves to round the party out really well, having solid physical attacks, the ability to mimic opponents, and access to all the spells that Ness and Paula learn. The boss fight here against the Plague Rat of Doom is so much fun. There isn't anything all that special about it, but with a full party you have so many options. Ness has strong physical attacks and good support magic. Paula isn't a slouch with her frying pan and has a bevy of offensive magic. Jeff by now has some really fun items from repairing, and Pooh is there to back up and slot into whatever role is needed in the moment. The depth of combat does a fantastic job at highlighting your growth, not just as someone playing the game, but of Ness as well. You finally feel powerful and strong. Having bested the rat, you leave the sewers to find yourself in the Magnet Hill Sanctuary. Ness sees a baby's bottle in his vision, a symbol of care and support. Next to the magnet is a gift with a carrot key inside. Earthbound uses its absurdity for good, using the strange memorable image of random rabbits in Dalam to make you know right away that that's where you need to go with this key. You rid the rabbits with the key and find yourself in another cave dungeon, at least being home to a few equipable items for Pooh. Traversing the cave and finding your way to the end puts you up against another sanctuary boss. I'm not going to belabor the point after I just covered it, which kinda is the point, but the pacing is so off here. There's a lack of focus that's a legitimate problem, creating cracks in the structure that the sanctuaries are attempting to hold up. At the sanctuary, Ness sees his mother as a child, again focus landing squarely on his mum and not his dad. Maybe he's thinking back to how the person he loves the most was also a kid like him at some point. She managed to become her own self-assured person, and so maybe he can too. After getting a code from the Scaraba museum at Summers, you use it to enter the pyramid, moving deeper and deeper. There is a boss fight here, but it's rather inconsequential, as in fight it for 30 seconds inconsequential. The battle backgrounds inside the pyramid are really great though. They represent the sand dunes of the desert, and the movement they have feels reminiscent of the heat causing the horizon to warp. Some of them are quite hypnotizing, perhaps replicating the delusion of exhaustion due to exposure to the sun. On a lower level of the pyramid you find the Hawkeye, which allows you to see in the dark. That's never been a problem up to this point, but that's obviously about to change. The exit lies at the end of a long hallway littered with enemies, switching up from the formula of ending with a boss to have you endure a long string of battles that keeps things fresh. Soon after exiting, someone flies in, insisting that Pooh must go with them to learn PSI Starstorm. With that, the shaman takes him from your party, which is super lame. You only get to have a full party for a couple hours, and combat does take a bit of a dive because of it. In this southern part of the desert, you'll run across Dungeon Man, one of the most memorable characters from the game. This is the guy from Winters, now having undergone the transformation into a dungeon. It's actually fairly grotesque when you think about how you go inside the Dungeon Man and basically traipse around his internal organs, but Earthbound is whimsical enough that you don't focus on that. What I love about him is how much of an anomaly he is, which is saying something considering Earthbound hardly has a normal to conform to. This place is essentially a debug room, with assets and tools from throughout the game thrown in here together just to make sure they work. The music has jutting metallic stabs and shaky percussion, like so many different ideas and concepts are bouncing around a developer's head. There are notes left lying around for testers, and the layout deceives any conception of spatial awareness and construction. This area not possibly fitting inside the Dungeon Man. The whole experience is ridiculous and relieving. The desert theme had been adhered to so completely that it's nice knowing Earthbound isn't going to settle, still shoving ludicrous but delightful scenarios at you. Once you make it to Dungeon Man's face, he offers to tag along. With him on your side, battles become a whole lot easier, and it's a hilariously goofy sight. Sadly, it comes to an end quickly as you need to go to a swamp called the Deep Darkness via a submarine. Fetching it from Dungeon Man, you say your goodbyes and take off for the swamp. The Deep Darkness is intense and dire, with the water bogging you down and hurting you if you stay submerged for too long. The environments of Earthbound have been getting more hostile as you go, though always planted under its layer of humour. The Deep Darkness largely abandons that to create a more purposefully stressful gameplay experience. being especially effective in part due to the perspective through which we see Earthbound, that being Ness's. It reminds you that there are still real stakes here. This isn't all just one big joke, restoring balance to Earthbound's sincerity and parody. The slower movement speed can make you a bit impatient, but it's appropriately designed around to prevent it from becoming a chore. The monsters also comply to more logic, being trees or eels or crocodiles. The crocodiles are still pink, but they're less fantastical than many other monsters you've encountered, and so they strengthen the Deep Darkness's dedication to dour discipline and consistent environmental disposition. That was stupid. The deadly atmosphere is dialed up when you encounter Mr. Belch, now Master Bath, stronger than ever and with no fly honey of yours to be distracted by. Because of my earlier stupidity in my fight with him, I knew full well how tough he can be, so it was a nerve-wracking fight. It was going pretty well, but that just made me worry about what massive onslaught of damage was coming my way, until Pooh swooped in with PSI Starstorm, promptly ending the battle. I do think I would have just preferred to have Pooh there the whole time, but it is an admittedly fantastic moment. Unfortunately, it also means any semblance of further character building or development for Pooh happens off-screen, which Earthbound would have really benefited from showing. From Master Bath, you get the Casey Bat for Ness. This weapon is unbelievably strong, but also misses like crazy. In my first playthrough, I was going insane as I slowly started to realise that Ness was missing so much. I seriously played with it equipped for hours, and then when I finally read the description, I just laughed at my idiocy and Earthbound's attitude. The game is being actively hostile towards you, but it's hard not to chuckle at. At last, you exit the swamp and enter Tender Village. Inhabited by these timid little guys, Tender Village isn't much of anything, a modest cave with few features. Because the Tenders are so shy, they won't actually talk to you, to the point where the item shop merchant isn't able to sell you anything, unless you get a book about overcoming shyness, so says the village's leader at least. With no way forward, you leave the village only to be caught by Apple Kid, who gets kidnapped halfway through the conversation. He's been with Andernuts in Winters, while in possession of the very book you're in need of. Upon arriving in Winters, you find out that Jeff's friend Tony has been captured as well. It's nice to have all these different threads converge, to give the objective purpose and the story in general some forward momentum after essentially coming to a standstill. As you make your way to the lab, you'll notice the robotic and extraterrestrial enemies, with Gygas's increased presence adding more weight to what will play out. And thank God Earthbound doesn't waste all this on a gag. It's utilised brilliantly as you venture underground in search of the missing people. The almost pulsing pathways and electronic hums that pass by each other make for a palpably ominous impression, where Earthbound's unpredictability will manifest as something shockingly dark, not funny, not too unlike back in Happy Happy Village. Then you have to contend with Starmen, really difficult robots that are practically impossible to evade. Their erratic nature takes control out of your hands, the confined spaces further restricting movement to push you to the point where you just want to get past this already. The Starmen are seriously intimidating with not a trace of emotion, and the goal to at times guard, confronting their own death with an uncaring, placid attitude that makes it feel like that if they wanted to, they could kill you as soon as they choose. This is when Earthbound is at its best, throwing you between comical but sweet situations and brooding dark sequences that make use of the previously established relationships you have with these strange but memorable characters. What makes these sequences so affecting though is restraint. There are spots that feel like filler, but I believe that only dawns on you when actively trying to find meaning or purpose in it as a game and story. When you've been courted into looking at the game through the lens of a kid, you take the moments as they come, making these gloomy events impactful, which is in keeping with Earthbound. An immature tilt is given to everything, and playing games as a child is more cerebral and reactive. Even what appear to be flaws in this game are driven by intent. But if you do see them as flaws, that's not invalid. There are problems here, but they're compelling ones that seem to come with the territory of crafting a more experimental and untraditional video game. So as you explore this place, you go down the exact same rabbit hole of thought that I just went down, meaning that what I just said wasn't out of place and impromptu. Soon finding the exit and breathing a sigh of relief because it's over. Shit, it's not over, it just got more intense. But I really don't mind. Earthbound's combat is seriously so much fun here, packed with tension and constant little decisions that feel important, like life or death are completely dependent on them. The cheeky thing here is, the Starman Super aren't particularly punishing. These are at this point standard enemies, so you're not meant to be spending all your PP on them, but you don't really realise that because of how thick the atmosphere and pressure is, which is clever and generous design. The party descend further, the environment getting more unstable and precarious. Whatever's going on here is upsetting the will of the earth in a way. The fact that all this machinery and mechanics sits inexplicably above a void leaves you feeling trapped, not by confining walls but endless nothingness, the potential of anything and everything removing itself from the shadows. Somehow navigating the hazardous path, you find all the missing people held in captivity. Earthbound resists the urge to turn the moment comedic, the characters playing it straight and reinforcing that this is serious. They're going to die if Ness doesn't help. After psyching themselves up, the crew approach the Starman next door. It mentions the Apple of Enlightenment, that which has predicted the prophecy that now unfolds. The Starman Deluxe promptly ended my entire shit with PSI Starstorm. And then I learned that your party members can only have one type of shield at once, either physical or PSI based. With that rectified, the Starman Deluxe isn't too tough. As you best it, the facility falls into disarray, no longer functioning. Seeing the NPCs freed is so rewarding, and their earnest responses hold genuine gratitude that makes the whole struggle worth it. Applekidd mentions that he left the Shyness book back in Onett, so it's time to visit Mum. The theme and exploration of nostalgia is now folded in on itself, as you find yourself back in Onett, comforted by the familiar theme while you reflect on the simpler times that you and Ness had here. Earthbound's dedication to get the player to view it how it wants, in the process playing into ideas of innocence and childhood, causes you to fall into a sentimental mood, so that you truly engage with Ness's journey and make note of how far you and him have come. Ness's growth then becomes obvious, despite him being tight-lipped and by all accounts shallow. The wacky circumstances you found yourself in cement themselves as memories, with them being so frequent that the oddities of Onett authentically feel like times long past. This idea isn't expanded upon for the other party members, but by this point they've thoroughly established themselves as part of the supporting cast, so while it's a missed opportunity, it isn't necessarily a disappointment. After chowing down on some homemade pizza, the crew head to the library and borrow the Overcoming Shyness book. With that in hand, they zip off to Tender Village. After the tribe have read the book, they're a lot more chatty, allowing you to buy items and such. You can also have another inspirational tea break now. It's perfectly timed, made available right after the journey back to Onett, when the player gets a firmer grasp on Ness as a character and the game's emotional core in general. You're plainly told that Gygas is on the back foot, and with only 2 sanctuaries to go, it provides a great shot of enthusiasm right when it's needed. You can now venture to the lost Underworld in search of the 2 remaining sanctuaries. So it's a shame that after such an invigorating sequence you should find yourself in yet another cave dungeon with little distinguishing features to call its own. There is a foreboding atmosphere that plays into your ignorance about this lost underworld you're soon to enter, but other than that and some talking rocks, it's quite a redundant location. Fortunately, it's not too long before you face the next sanctuary guard, the Electro Spectre. That trusty battle background now sways with more vigour, representing Gygas' wavering faith that he can thwart Ness and his friends. As these sanctuary bosses become more abstract, Gygas throwing out foes closer and closer in relation to him, considering we know nothing about him save for his searing villainy and lust for evil. The fight itself is really engaging, combat is still a treat with these 4. I believe this boss can actually mimic some of your party's abilities, demonstrated by its use of the Hungry HP Sucker, a machine Jeff can use. This further exemplifies Gygas' loss of ideas, vainly trying to create a winning strategy out of copying what Ness, Paula, Jeff and Pooh can do. After besting the Electro Spectre, you descend into the next sanctuary, Lumine Hall. The cavern is illuminated by dotted lights. A stone wall begins to display Ness's thoughts, verifying his connection to this world, as someone meant to save it and look after it. It also finally gives us a direct line to what Ness is thinking. There's hesitation and concern, Ness still not having firm confidence in who he is, a display of an intensely human thought process. It's reassuring to get some acknowledgement that yes, what you've projected onto Ness wasn't projected at all, it was authentic and accurate. The soundstone records the melody and you fall into the lost underworld. There's a fun gimmick at play and it pays off. The underworld feels really large, carving out its own identity with the prehistoric theme. It's tying the concepts of memory and nostalgia into that of time, as you find yourself in a land that's presumably billions of years old. I will say that actually exploring the lost underworld is very cumbersome, with odd collision leaving you unsure of where you can actually go. It doesn't ruin the area or anything, but adds some extra hassle to a core part of Earthbound's gameplay loop. You can find these springs that replenish health or remove status effects, but they don't have much significance when it's all said and done. Interestingly, the 3 places that are less traditionally civilized all have access to these healing substances. Tender Village and Satin Valley have hot springs that completely heal you, probably being made up of the two separate liquids we see here in the Lost Underworld. So could there be a connection there, with these three places being more in touch with our own history, aka memory, and roots, as such still having access to such a valuable resource, while the humans pay a high price just to have a rest? I'm not so sure, as these springs are very rare and never dwelled or expanded upon, but I just thought I'd throw it out there. There's a couple more tender settlements down here, and one is home to a talking rock which apparently has much to say to you. Sadly, little of it is new. It just reiterates what we already know, that Ness is fated to fight Gygus and that he needs the 8 melodies to do it. This is a band-aid to a problem. I've mentioned the wonky treatment of sanctuaries, fading in and out of the game's focus, sometimes barely mentioned and other times brought up repeatedly. This stone will remind you to make sure you've got the first 7 sanctuaries, but an actual solution that sees consistent emphasis on this aspect of the game would be much more preferable. The one useful bit of info it passes on is the location of the 8th sanctuary, the Fire Spring, which can be found southwest of your current position. After gearing up, the crew take off southwest to claim the last melody. It certainly feels final, with a hostile location that's filled with tough enemies, but also some totally useless ones that may just be there to take up time, causing your health to tick by as they do. The slowdown here gets incredibly obnoxious. This happens once there's enough sprites on the screen, but the game suffers for it here in particular. It makes it harder to evade enemies and just isn't pleasurable. This isn't unique to Earthbound. Plenty of SNES games just tell you to deal with bad performance, but it's worth bringing up as a negative. After an onslaught of battles, you're face to face with the 8th Sanctuary Guard. This is the Carbon Dog. Now, I'd be remiss not to mention this one tiny thing I've for some reason focused on so frequently, so to get it out of the way once and for all, the battle background now flashes and pulses. That's right people, it's flashing and pulsing, signalling movement and panic or indecision, Ness getting too close for comfort for Gygus. The Carbon Dog is really intimidating with its intense sprite and the stakes of the fight, but it'll prove to be not much of a problem. It has a powerful fireball attack, but managing to heal is a simple task at this point, until it transforms into its true carbon form. Now deflecting attacks that it's goaded you into making after lulling you into a false sense of security. It now has the chance of instantly killing party members with PSI Flash, which can cause some real problems if you don't have them equipped with the right pendant. This specific move pulls the rug out from under you. Mortal blows have over time become less serious as the higher max HP of the characters makes healing them in time feasible. But now deaths are instant, as though the Carbon Dog is using PSI Flash because of the vulnerability in your strategy that it exploits. The tension is dialed way up, creating a nice narrative and flow to the encounter. After some nail-biting turns, the Carbon Dog falls to Paula's magic. Ness records the Fire Springs melody, and upon hearing the completed song, has a vivid vision of watching himself as a baby, as his mum and dad fawn over him. Ness has so thoroughly contemplated who he is and who he has been, what destiny and responsibility is shackled to him, that he's achieved acute self-awareness, causing him to collapse and wake up in his own mind. And how else would a kid like Ness tackle a complex, heady task like gaining understanding of the self, if not through a whimsical world of his own creation that's filled with carnival music and populated by all the notable people in his life? Getting such a thorough view into Ness as a person, it almost recontextualizes his silence thus far. Being met with such outlandish situations, and the emotionally mature implications they carry with them, could very likely rob him of words, of the ability to talk about and digest what's going on. As you walk around and talk to people, the entire colour palette will morph and change, with it altering the emotional impression Magicant gives off. After talking to his mum, everything's awash in shades of pink and purple, colours we associate with love and affection. When talking to the shaman who explains what's happening to Ness, everything becomes darker and murkier, Ness still feeling out of his own depth despite literally standing in his own depth. They don't all have such obvious through lines, but even those colour-based connections that aren't immediately identifiable speak to a turbulent, uncertain state of mind, which accurately plays into who Ness is. The colours will also revert back to default after talking to sunflowers, as they impart some sort of meditative, mindful advice that helps him calm down and prepare himself. On the second island of Magicant you can find Porky. He's envious of Ness and asks if they can still be friends. So does Ness think of Porky as merely jealous, feeling sorry for him and understanding him as someone who's desperately wanted companionship or attention? Well, that may be the case. Although he's a snide brat, he also doesn't seem to have any friends and gets physically abused by his father, as we see in the beginning. That gives him motivation and purpose to act as he does now, and Ness's proximity to him would explain a lingering sense of empathy he feels towards Porky. I wish this was explored more, as then there would be a more complex, thoughtful villain and Gygus, creating larger stakes and urgency to the narrative. But there is something under the surface of Porky, which I appreciate. Further along you come across the Flying Men, a manifestation of Ness's courage. They're essentially superheroes, the perfect paragon that kids look up to, tagging along to provide assistance with their chests puffed out. And they'll be a big help for what comes next. Ness now has to engage with the darker part of himself as combat is brought into Magicant. He steals his courage, the Flying Man, and moves on. The encounters here are dull and inflexible, giving you very little space to mechanically move thanks to Ness being the only controllable character. There's an expression of dependency that Ness had on his friends, the only backup he has now being his courage, reassurance and determination that's of his own making and manifesting. The enemies here play into ideas that would make him insecure or unsure, like gifts. Earthbound has through repetition built up an implicit understanding that gift boxes reward you, but here they attack you, creating deception. Then there are bulging eyes that expectantly follow him, the eyes that Ness feel trained on him because of his destiny and the pressure that they weigh him down with. The background animations of course contribute, generally featuring a larger range of colours with more explicitly psychedelic patterns and more movement, conveying a volatile state of mind. It's not just battles that play into this, but the geography. You're now on a winding road that's unpredictable, unlike the rather small, self-contained islands we've just seen. There's less structure and direction, being the path that Ness has had to carve out so far on his adventure, having little long-term guidance. Ness as a person is explored so effectively here, using more visceral elements to show you how he feels rather than just telling you, giving you access to interact with it. Magicant doesn't feel unnatural either from a gameplay standpoint. The mechanics accommodate what's going on because the battle system in Earthbound's identity of strange circumstances and emotional engagement feeds seamlessly into Magicant's realization as a piece of the game. Simply put, Magicant compensates for the lackluster presence of character arcs by tapping back into the idea of examining what being a JRPG protagonist would do to a kid, placating you with fun characters and scenarios in the meantime to ensure that this series of events can be optimally placed in terms of the game's structure and Ness's journey as a kid who's become that JRPG protagonist. Ness fights his way to the centre of this path, finding a sort of metallic strand appearing in the Lake of Eden after interacting with it. The music personifies a lack of direction, with additional sounds occasionally toppling and tripling over the central drone, placed with little intent or purpose. Sharp pillars of iridescent crystal stab out into the air, like violent outbursts that interrupt the feeling of loss that keeps Ness trapped and sluggish, the walls and water being the manifestation of those sensations. There are deadly krakens here that stalk the still lake, but Ness can easily overcome them thanks to what he's been through. We remember that the kraken is a glass cannon from the fight we had in our way to Scaraba. Ness is capable of finding himself, of regaining control, but he'll have to fight for it. Ness's nightmare, made to resemble the Money Money statue, is waiting for him, a monument to control, having robbed many of their agency as we've seen firsthand. The statue didn't enchant Ness explicitly, but took hold of him subconsciously, Ness's battle being primarily emotional and spiritual as always. The nightmare pelts you with PSI music, healing itself to undo any meager progress you make, a moveset strikingly similar to Ness's own. The background shows that the statue's influence no longer radiates outwards, rather commanding attention, distracting Ness and causing his doubt to fester, pulling the energy inwards. It's a brutal battle overall, possibly ending in a heartbeat thanks to PSI Flash. Every move you make has consequences here. The nightmare's high damage output makes any use of PSI a possible waste of PP that you'll need for healing. The shield deflects physical attacks, having to damage yourself to make a dent, and not making an offensive attack can just give the statue time to restore all its health. I had a lot of trouble with it, only to emerge victorious after a minute thanks to some lucky crits, which isn't very appropriate given what Ness is fighting for here. Only winning thanks to randomness that's out of his control, but hey, I'll take it. With the nightmare defeated, Ness speaks to himself, understands that he must accept his responsibility and who he is as a person to save the universe. As he reaches enlightenment, he's filled with power by the 8 sanctuaries, not just the experiences that led him there, but the memories he looked back on while recording the melodies. As he crests his emotional zenith, his HP and PP fluctuate, overflowing almost, existing outside of the established rules as a signifier of just how powerful Ness has become, thanks to his capacity to withstand and overcome mental hardship. What happened at Magicant will make the fight with Gygas more manageable on a gameplay level. With Magicant being no more, Ness wakes back up. He had been muttering about Saturn Valley while unconscious, so Jeff, Pooh, Paula and Ness teleport there right away. Once you arrive, you'll find that Apple Kid, Dr. Andernuts and Mr. Saturn have been building the Phase Distorter, a teleportation device needed to find Gygas. The kids try and use it, but it fails, still needing a piece of meteorite to function properly. The meteorite back in Onett should do the trick. Ness's hometown is now overrun by Gygas' forces, having driven everyone back inside their homes, robbing it of its character and heart. Revisiting Onett doesn't just show Ness's growth, but also Gygas'. His threat is now more immediate and pressing as we near our clash with him. The Ghost of Starmen try to thwart Ness, but he and his friends overcome the hurdle, reaching the meteorite and taking the piece. This whole adventure has come full circle, enforcing a sense of finality to the quest which leaves you absolutely ready to end this. I talked to Ness's mum one last time because it just made sense, and then flew back to Saturn Valley. Now was the time to prepare. Purchasing the items you need should be no problem because you'll likely have way more money than you know what to do with. That happens around the time you're in Scaraba and does water down the experience a little, as there's no longer decisions around gear to be made when you can so easily buy the most powerful pieces available. I made a point to go back to Lumion Hall and retrieve the Rabbit's Foot, which would increase Pooh's speed and ensure I could escape battles if necessary. Andernuts fixes the Phase Distorter and the party enter it, arriving in the Cave of the Past. The terrain hangs suspended in the air, preserved perfectly to give no indication of time or place, like a purgatory. Horns that may be used to communicate grandeur in another game here echo out, calling but receiving no response, cultivating an isolating, unnerving atmosphere. You can actually access a chunk of this place from the Lost Underworld. There you couldn't make it to the Steely Strand, but now that you've been through Magicant, where we saw the coiled, confused strand, Ness can grasp it and make contact. A Mr. Saturn was kidnapped and forced to create a Phase Distorter by Porky, his collusion with Gygas up to now being pretty obvious, but it's blatantly confirmed here. Soon enough, a third Phase Distorter fades in, Andernuts, Apple Kid and Mr. Saturn hopping out. They tell you that regressing further into the past will bring you to Gygas, though they're reluctant to shed some light on the details. In a game that has a very forthright, honest tone of writing, seeing such hesitance holds more weight. To survive the teleportation, the crew would have to abandon their physical forms, having their soul planted into a robot. Ness, now knowing himself completely, agrees. The four are transferred into the robot avatars, and they hop into the Phase Distorter 3. They step out of the device and onto the bare ground with a metallic thud. What surrounds you is defined by what it lacks, not what it features. The environment looks unfinished, without texture or character. The slabs of rock don't fade into a bed of fog, but just remain incomplete. Distorted vocal samples draw out at different speeds, not yet having a purpose or position to fill. The recognisably human visages of the main cast are no more. This place, and Earth in general, is still under construction essentially. The path forward is laced with ruthless foes that prove to be a formidable challenge in their own right. These fights are where the different party members shine through, still fulfilling the role they play in combat, harbouring recognisable human traits even within these mechanical carcasses. This still in development build of the Cave of the Past is oppressive and palpably bleak. In a world that seems endlessly inventive and creative, such bland presentation is creepy and almost scary. It makes such a strong impression, I really can't overstate that. After so many random situations bereft of logic, they are ascribed meaning purely because of how they contrast the Cave of the Past. They're not just cute moments that make you laugh anymore, they're the pulse of this world, fueling it and driving it forward, giving it personality and character, ultimately depth. And none of that life and essence can be found here. After clinging to life desperately and praying that the enemy spawns are kind to you, you will thankfully come to an opening in a rock face. It isn't a positive sign necessarily, but it is at least something that shakes up the eerily monotonous landscape you've been traversing. You enter and find yourself in what looks like an intestinal tract. As slow breaths are drawn and released, creating a vile, almost acrid ambience that imparts a feeling of dread. This kind of imagery isn't really exclusive to Earthbound. I think Chrono Trigger moves in this direction a bit by the end, but I don't know of another game that creates such a striking juxtaposition. From the happy-go-lucky tales filled with whimsy to a sickly, cold mashup of plain, lifeless structures and clinical biological landscapes. Entering this area cemented an idea as to what the Cave of the Past is to me. I see it as the gestating fetus of this world. This place is so bare because it's the rough sketch of an entity not yet finished. We've entered the world's womb. This invokes connections to the game's themes. We've delved into the planet's memories by going so far back into the past. By stopping Gygas, we will be halting his negative influence and allowing the world to grow up, just as Ness has done over the course of this adventure. Now, I don't see this fleshy area as where the world will literally be born from, but I rather see the whole area we've just covered as a more abstract starting point, with the biological theming here bringing that to mind more explicitly. Earthbound has managed to make the hackneyed idea of the villain destroying the world relate to what the game is about. By tying the villain's scheme and Ness's evolution as a person together thematically, a more genuine and credible case has been made for the idea of destiny. RPGs love having you play a chosen one fated to save the world, but it so often feels lazy. But with what Ness has gone through, it makes sense that he's honestly the only person who could best Gygas. This is Earthbound again playing off the history of RPGs, but reorganizing and interpreting it into something to call its own, making it feel fresh and exciting again. The party reach the end of the passage and are confronted by Porky. He and Gygas wish to defy the Apple of Enlightenment and what is predicted. Porky sits in a mechanical spider, his skin a sickly green-grey, thoroughly abandoning a sense of humanity. Gygas is in the background, organic fibres supporting a central orb that displays Ness's countenance. This could be Ness's reflection as he stares at the orb, but I think of it as a lens. Gygas is so consumed by his desire to kill Ness that that's all he concerns himself with, being reflected in how he outwardly appears. The sprite of Ness's face in this instance is also very similar to the one we see when you get a game over, pointing further to the extent of Gygas' motive. In addition, he can use PSI music, which so far has only been grasped by Ness and his nightmare, communicating even more obsession. Gygas can't be attacked, deflecting or avoiding anything thrown his way, so instead you focus on Porky. He's pretty easy to pacify, succumbing to PSI paralysis, allowing you to focus fire on him once you realise it's no use trying to attack Gygas. The music is initially reminiscent of an 8-bit theme you'd hear on the NES, playing off the idea of memory and nostalgia that this location and battle are related to. It soon switches up, sounding not unlike something from Doom. It's abandoning the kind of cute aesthetics of that 8-bit music, and embracing the desperate, intense sounds that are now possible, bringing us back to the present. Although Porky is not as tough as he first appears, the fight is no less fierce. Everything at play here is so tied to all your previous actions that there's an inherent immense weight to this encounter, adding pressure to every press of a button, resulting in an incredibly engaging fight. After taking enough of a beating, Porky will get to talking. He gloats, asking if you want him to turn off the devil's machine, that being the viscera-laden prison Gygus is contained in. Porky frees him from the machine and we see Gygus completely for the first time. His expansive power rotted his mind, no longer acting under any sense of rationale. He's a twisted, anguished face, purely conceptual and abstract. Porky leaves you alone with him. God, what an awesome decision. Throughout all of Earthbound, the background animations are a vague, emotive thing that convey feeling in a visceral sense. They have become the canvas that you spill blood on, being the representation of battle, of violence. So that's exactly what Gygus is. Bigger than just an enemy you fight, but the source from which all those enemies draw evil and hatred from. The music here doesn't come across as music, but as diegetic sound, the distressed howls of an evil entity, oozing out and smearing across your ears. I was just left speechless. I didn't know how to digest or comprehend quite what was happening, which is perfect. How else could you make Gygus, a villain never seen or heard, live up to expectation? I don't think you could. He hurls undefined attacks at you, muttering Nessa's name. Gygus almost seems uncaring, maybe lacking the constitution to form impulses, wants, or needs. Being met with such blatant apathy by the thing that's been tearing your world apart is creepy, the lack of physical form only enhancing that. I kept wailing on him, but with such listless visual feedback there's no way to tell if any sort of progress is being made. Eventually Porky showed back up, mocking Ness, Paula, Jeff and Pooh for their futile effort. During the speech he mentions calling for help, and that was at least something actionable, so I started using Paula's pray command. Gygus shakes and warps faster, with a more discernible rhythm to the music. This time when Paula prays, you see Andernuts, Apple Kid and the Mr. Satins praying for you. This makes Gygus unstable, now a sea of these pained expressions, drifting back and forth with distorted colouring. The silhouette of a baby can be seen in the negative space of the pattern, incorporating the theme of childhood and demonstrating Gygus' regression. What a relief! After treading water and hoping something works, slowly feeling the inevitable pull of failure, you've struck something. It's a shot in the arm, finally finding a weakness to exploit. There's underlying logic in this, because why would you fight such an evil, abstract power through violence? That's more like feeding it. You instead make it face the one thing it refuses or misunderstands. Love, faith and connection. Humanity. Gygus now forms new sentences, asking you to leave him alone or to let him be happy. He's trying to pull at Ness's empathy and deceive him, but Ness isn't just some naive kid anymore. He's his own person, self-aware and self-assured. You see more and more people pray for you, doing more and more damage as you continue to call out. You see all the people you met, all the memories you made, and it does motivate you thanks to the mechanical influence they have by damaging Gygus. Once Ness's family begins to pray, Gygus starts unraveling, chaotically thrashing around, losing his tenuous grasp on reality and calling out with mangled chirps. I don't know if this is intentional or not, but the UI leaves artifacts as you navigate it, like Gygus is causing the SNES itself to become unstable and unresponsive. Paula's prayers no longer reach anyone. I tried again, having legitimate faith and hope that someone would respond, and they did. This person prays repeatedly, decimating Gygus in the process, and it turned out to be me. The game had asked my name a couple times, and it's used here to deliver the final blows. Earthbound has gotten you so invested that you do kind of pray that something here works, and that wish manifests. It's just so fucking good. After enough hits, Gygus deconstructs, with Porky escaping to another dimension, asking you who's the cool one now. A lonely kid who was treated horribly, who went on to gather immense power in search of the recognition and validation he craved. I hate him, but there is tragedy and nuance there I really appreciate. Gygus blinks out of existence much like a TV, maybe doing so due to how Ness perceives Gygus through his own perspective. We see the 4 robotic bodies lay unmoving on the cold, distressed stone of the cave of the past. The spirit of Pooh, Jeff, Paula and Ness leave the cave and re-enter the 4 empty bodies now resting in Saturn Valley. Pooh says goodbye and travels back to Dalam, leaving some parting gifts. Jeff is going to stay in the valley with his dad, and Ness is going to walk Paula home to Twoson. I think these additional party members could have had much more in the way of development, depth and presence, but I ultimately still cared for them, so it is sad to see them go. The gifts contain letters from people important to the party and they reel Earthbound's mundanity back in, proving that everything's back to normal. I went and chatted to a bunch of people all around the world. They were part of one of the strangest, best experiences I've had playing video games, so seeing them one last time felt right. After dropping Paula off at the daycare, Ness makes his way back to Onett, back to being its same old self. His mum and dad comment on him sounding older and more mature, and you're given the chance to look around for as long as you like. It's nice that you get to choose where this ends. Players have no doubt formed an emotional attachment, and letting them exercise that allows us to determine closure essentially. It ends on the note you want it to. As Ness starts discussing his journey with his mum, Earthbound comes to a close. A credit sequence of the cast of characters rolls by, feeling super appropriate for Earthbound, what with its instantly memorable NPCs. The phono man takes one last picture, but this time of you, as the staff credits begin to roll, showing off all the places you've been and memories you've made, tinted with a sepia tone to amp up the sentimentality.
I miss you.
Whew, God, what a journey. Earthbound is undoubtedly one of a kind, not just within the space of JRPGs, but games in general. The unique setting makes everything you do feel inspired and fresh, holding novelty even all these years later. It uses its identity as a pastiche to reinvent ideas and make commentary on video games that's entertaining while holding actual weight as criticism. The graphics may seem simple, but they're an important contributor to the game's charm, adding colour and personality to everything. They give life to a broad spectrum of cultures and environments, helping your playthrough read as a genuine journey across the world. The tone of voice is distinct, leaning into humour that doesn't feel forced while tapping into earnest sentimentality that avoids being saccharine. There's still nuance within Earthbound's voice though, with the denizens of Fourside coming across as more selfish and stuck up than the deeply intertwined residents of Onett, for example. Each major location has small tweaks in the writing, at times having those shifts relate to the plot, justifying and explaining them. The music is diverse but endlessly catchy, legitimizing the different moods that Earthbound tries to capture. I honestly can't say enough good things about the soundtrack. The world overall is one you explore enthusiastically, with something new around every single corner, making very few moments feel wasted or empty. There are quirks within each gameplay system to give them their own identity and place within Earthbound as a game and universe. The inventory and money management is frustrating and obtuse, but it's at least trying something new, in the process implanting them into the world and setting, deepening your interaction with it. Combat starts out slow but builds into compelling battles that see each party member fulfilling a unique role. The expansive cast of foes, myriad of battle themes and background animations contribute to the fun of combat, rounding out that experience and giving it greater meaning. Everything I've just touched on all feed into the changes that Ness goes through. He's by all accounts a silent, blank slate of a character, but there is a journey there, one that the player connects to deeply because we've all had to endure the process of self-exploration and understanding. By easing us into looking at Earthbound through the eyes of a child, it filters everything you experience through that lens, having it contribute to Ness's development in different ways. As such, we care and relate to him even further, making the sudden shifts in tone and subject matter thought-provoking and engaging. It balances its two sides, the humorous and serious, fantastically, always keeping the player's attention, causing you to pick up what's being laid before you. Its subversion of expectations is really effective and serves to further communicate what Ness goes through, having a greater purpose and intention to make it feel genuine and necessary. Most importantly, Earthbound is a game brimming with heart and humanity. Its flaws are mostly endearing attempts at experimentation. Its self-referential attitude and understanding of JRPG tropes are utilised in a way that shows respect and appreciation for them while acknowledging their shortcomings. The other party members are unfortunately underexplored, but you still care about them, by virtue of existing in a world that you're passionate about saving. The way it navigates themes of memory, maturity, growing up and childhood are thoughtful and well considered. It rounds out to become a much more sophisticated examination of these ideas than you'd initially think. I don't quite love it as much as Mother 3, I think that game does a better job fleshing out its characters and I find what it has to say more interesting. But Earthbound is still an incredible experience, with so many unique ideas coursing through its veins, providing near constant entertainment and engagement. The sheer amount of charm and character and creativity to be found is staggering, and replaying it was an absolute treat. There's absolutely nothing quite like Earthbound, and I doubt there ever will be.